I'm a reporter with Devex. Thank you so much for joining us from wherever you are in the world today for this exciting session where we will be releasing the new report, Building for Peace, Reconstruction for Security, Sustainable Peace and Equity in the MENA region. We are really excited to have a high-level panel with us this morning to discuss all of the work that went into producing this report and its exciting findings as a part of the virtual Fragility Forum 20 that remains ongoing throughout the summer with the World Bank. 9 years after the Arab Spring, people in Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen face tragic levels of death, destruction, displacement, and disorder. 2003 to 2017, or excuse me, from 2013 to 2017, the Middle East and North Africa region alone accounted for 68% of the global adult deaths. Yemen is facing the largest humanitarian crisis with close to 80% of the population in need. Conflicts in Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen in many ways epitomize a type of conflict that has been evolving since the end of the Second World War. These conflicts have become increasingly unpredictable, often localized in parts of a country while affecting the existing regional and international political dynamics. They have fractured relationships within and between communities, undermined social cohesion, and have drawn in multiple regional and global actors with different interests. They have also reconfigured economies in war-torn societies and their neighboring countries, supporting the flourishing of illicit and informal undertakings and economic activities, prompting the establishment of war. Spawning insecurity, mass displacement, and disorder, these conflicts are testing the limits of reconstruction and peace-building approaches centered on state building. The Building for Peace report, which built on significant contributions of previous research, is grounded in the World Bank's new FCV strategy to propose a multidisciplinary approach to reconstruction and peacebuilding for MENA countries and beyond. It recognizes the difficulties of moving from abstract aspirational prescriptions to active engagement in very difficult and fluid environments. The report argues that because of the nature of the conflict has changed and remains, particularly in MENA, dynamic and protracted, the ways governments, development actors, stakeholders, and donors assess, plan, and engage in those environments must also change. We are excited to hear and learn more about the report this morning. We welcome your active engagement in the chat box on YouTube. So if you, throughout the conversation, have a question for one of our panelists, please put it in the chat box and we will have time for question and answer at the beginning of the session. Now I'd like to introduce our panel and we will get started. Joining us, we have Ayat Soliman, the Regional Director for Sustainable Development with the Department for Middle East and North Africa region at the World Bank Group. We also have Nadir Mohammed, who's the Regional Director at the Equitable Growth Finance and Institutions for Middle East and North Africa region at the World Bank Group. Volker Oel is Commissioner of the Middle East, MENA, Southeastern, Eastern Europe, and Latin America for the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And we also have joining us Maha Yahya, Director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for being with us this morning. And I'd like to start with a question to Nadir. As we move from conflict to sustainable peace, this is an extremely challenging and risky proposal. We've seen many countries that have relapsed into conflict after an initial period of stability. How can countries break the cycle of violence and reduce the risk that they relapse into conflict?
Thank you very much, Teresa. I think it's important that we transition from conflict to peace, and it's true, it's challenging and risky. Transition to sustainable peace is complex, particularly in our MENA region, where the protracted conflict are intertwined and often involve different local, regional, and international actors, both formal and informal. Just to give you a data point, 90% of all the wars between 2000 and 2010 took place in countries that experience civil wars in the preceding 30 years. And if we come back to our MENA region, the four countries that are witnessing conflict, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Yemen, also unfortunately illustrate how conflict cycles are intertwined and that the biggest predictor of future conflict is past conflict. So to your question, how can we change this pattern? The first step is to ensure that the transition from conflict to peace does not lead to relapse into another cycle of violence, is to articulate a very clear long-term strategy that address the existing grievances and also map out policy trade-offs. This is necessary to avoid unintended consequences. So instead of blindly rebuilding the past, we should instead think about building differently, focusing on those affected and involved in the conflict, their need and their interests. So this calls for a different mindset that moves away from bricks and mortars towards people. That's a central message and a central conclusion of this very important report. So this calls from, it also requires a balancing of the short-term needs and priorities of a country with a long-term development outcomes, especially those that reduce the likelihood of relapse into conflict. So this long-term strategy should focus on how to build people's sense of security and trust, and how to create time and space for building inclusive societies and institutions. It should shed light on the grievances and conflict drivers while moving beyond and creating zones of accountability to reduce impunity and to limit opportunities for the spoilers of peace. Let's take Iraq as an example. How can we as a development institution or actor work together more effectively to break the cycle of violence in Iraq that has trapped the country for 3 decades? Our collective effort in the country illustrate that the tension and mismatch between the country needs coming out of conflict and short-term priority identified by the international and local actors. So the country went through a reconstruction process after the 2003, led by the US state, only to relapse into violent internal conflict in 2014 and the rise of the Islamic State. During this period, nearly $60 billion was spent on reconstruction after 2003, according to the Special Inspector General for Iraq Construction final report in 2013. So most of this targeting the oil sector, but it only employed 1 or 2% of Iraq labor force, those failing to diversify the Iraqi economy and create jobs outside the large public sector. So this is just another clear example of why it's important to move to a sustainable peace. And if we are not addressing the wider needs of people and job prospect, then the likelihood of relapse is high. In retrospect, this mismatch between the local needs and the focus of reconstruction programs seems to have left the driver of conflict and fragility unaddressed for more than a decade. Therefore, to break this cycle of violence that trap Iraq or other MENA countries is key to untangle how the various armed groups build their economic and political base, how they are included in the national and local political economy environment, and the relationship that they foster with the community they claim to secure and represent. So understanding these dynamics allow us as practitioners to map out incentive, the push factors for violence, and therefore better we tailor our interventions to offer support for sustainable peace. And this will be based on the dynamic and asset present on the ground. So from our point of view as a development practitioner, this requires knowledge of understanding not only the history and of the local dynamics. Finally, if we need also to stay engaged in this challenging environment, like the example that we are doing currently in Libya or in Yemen. In Libya in particular, the bank has been implementing innovative and flexible approach to be able to provide technical assistance and technical advice on public financial management issues, leadership on strategic skills, statistical capacity building. So despite the challenging circumstances on the ground, we still engage on those very important aspects. So again, these points are very much in line with the new fragility strategy of the World Bank.
Great, thank you so much for that overview, Nadir. Ayat, I'd like to go to you next. We just heard about the importance of having a long-term vision and a way to understand challenges and the alternatives for rebuilding states in the MENA region that are experiencing these challenges. And the bank's updated FCV strategy and the report both point to the need to avoid blind spots when intervening in conflict settings. I'd love to hear more about, based on your experience, what are some of the first steps that practitioners should be taking when they're planning for interventions in these settings so we can avoid making the same mistakes over and over again?
Thank you so much, Teresa. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today on this important launch of a report that has been marked by a lot of interest and great partnership. And it's also very timely. It's timely for us in MENA, given, of course, the centrality of this topic for the MENA region and the work of the bank and other partners in it, but also with the broader FCV strategy of the bank, and the two really go hand in hand. So let me, in answering your question, first recognize that it's quite difficult to move from abstract theories. Actually, how do you design and implement practical operations that are useful to the citizens of the country and to the people that are in need? My colleague Nadir mentioned knowledge of local dynamics, which is critical. So we really need to focus on the people, their needs, and their assets. And let me explain a little bit what that means. The first important step is to have a comprehensive and dynamic assessment process to planning these interventions. It's not feasible to go and say this design of this intervention is going to serve a new set of people in a new country or a new region in a country without really understanding. So we need to understand to use existing assessment tools, that we traditionally use, but still be creative about adding in modifications necessary to gain this greater understanding of who are the actors, what are their interests, the institution, and the structural factors on the ground. And every time that is different. And so we need to collect this information without blinders, and it goes back to your point, Teresa, about the blind spot, in an inclusive way if we aim at breaking the cycle of violence in a specific place and for our interventions to have that impact. Before I go to explaining a little bit more what collecting information without blinders really means, let me share with you the example of South Sudan. So donors, as you know, mobilized substantial assistance in the wake of the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Assessment Agreement, and again on South Sudan's independence in 2011. But a review of their assessment and programs from 2013 and 14 found that the South Sudanese Liberation Army, their families and constituents, and the leaders of many communities up the Nile were rarely, if ever, consulted in these assessments. And their needs were scarcely being considered, much less met. And so major constituents for peace building have been overlooked. And when asked, some found that the return to conflict is preferable. And that has been documented in our World Development Report of 2011. So then let me go back. What do we mean by more comprehensive and dynamic assessment and taking off the blinders, right? Without blinders. So one critical element is finding ways to listen to the voices of all the people living through these difficult situations, not just those that we traditionally interact with that are easier to access. Part of the background work of this particular report and why it's so rich was a series of anonymous online surveys launched in Iraq, Libya, and Yemen, conducted in partnership with a surveying firm. These surveys collected data from over 13,000 citizens and allowed the team to capture the point of view of those that have been living under conflict and what they thought was needed, not just to transition out of conflict, but in order to build sustainable peace. And interestingly, a lot of what the hopes, aspirations, and demands from the people were much more in the intangible space. So a lot stressed that since the beginning of the war, what they lost most was hope for their children's future, more than anything else, more than their physical infrastructure, their services, etc. And so we really need to pay more attention to these intangible destructions. And then we need to, as we have always been doing, but really pay more attention to forging partnerships at the local, national, and regional, international level, and think about how do we find entry points to build incrementally on these assets that are present, and try to engage these counterparts with greater flexibility. And again, this depends on how effective the partnership can be and the role of the bank in convening the different stakeholders and having a broader outreach with a wide range of stakeholders. In Yemen, for example, our engagement builds a lot on a very strong partnership with UN institutions, but also with local partners across the spectrum, and looking at means to deliver critical services while also maintaining the focus and the view on building local institutions and social capital that underpins the rebuilding of the fabric and the state and the institutions that can help the people. And let me just end by saying that this report itself is a great example of partnership, in this case between the World Bank and the German government. And those are the partnerships that really help us forge the bridge and identify what is needed going forward, particularly in terms of where the bank sees its role as a bridge between the humanitarian and development peace nexus. Better coordination between the actors in the FCD setting will help us ensure that we continue to work through towards this long-term vision of what do we want to achieve, and then building step by step and mapping out the interventions to get there. Let me stop here. Thank you, Teresa.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ayat. And I think that point of partnerships is so key when we're talking about things in this context, right, in fragile and conflict-affected states, to make sure it really is a true partnership and that it's not, particular institutions or countries coming in and saying, this is what you should be doing, but we're actually engaging everyone. Volker, I'd love to go to you next to talk a little bit about the partnerships angle. As we've been talking about, engaging with the diverse set of actors obviously is challenging, but it's very important. Could you tell us a little bit about how the German government views this and any experiences you might have in making sure that your work is truly taking into account all of the voices that are necessary?
Thank you very much, Teresa, and good afternoon from Germany. Let me first say that today's topic and the launch of the Building for Peace report are very important for Germany. As you might know, Germany is one of the biggest bilateral donors in the MENA region, not only in the region in the context of the Syria crisis, but also in Iraq and in Yemen. And it's from these experiences that we share the sentiment, or rather the conviction, that we need to approach the important topic of reconstruction in a different manner. And I think when we look at the region, we also see, and Teresa, you've referred to that in your introductory remarks, and also the previous speakers have referred to that, that we find ourselves more and more in protracted crisis settings. Conflicts get more and more complex, grievances get more and more severe, and while rebuilding infrastructure is always a first visible sign of hope, I think we need to go beyond that and also work on the social fabric of societies and also rebuild societies. And this is why reconstruction needs to be seen as a long-term process. And it has to go far beyond rebuilding physical infrastructure and providing humanitarian assistance, but rather pave the way towards peace building, towards reforms, towards renewal of social contracts and sustainable development. And only then, and you've asked that question earlier, I think we will be able to prevent relapsing into conflict situations. And only then, I think we will get a good return of investment, a good return on our investments in the region. And this is, I think, the key reason why we entered into a partnership with the World Bank around the issue of building for peace, and why we co-funded the report which is being launched today. I think with this cooperation, we are taking our partnership to a new strategic level, and I personally find that the report is not only an inspiration for the World Bank's FCV strategy, but it's also an inspiration for our German Development Corporation in the MENA region. And I really do hope that the report will be an inspiration for other partners to think about reconstruction differently. But to come back to your question, as you said, one of the key messages from the Building for Peace report is the focus on engaging different actors, of engaging, I think, all actors or all relevant actors, and also to focus on social cohesion and bottom-up processes. And I think this resonates strongly with the German approach, because it's about empowering those actors, be it state or non-state actors on the ground, that are willing to support vulnerable populations. It's about facilitating dialogue amongst the different stakeholders to negotiate different interests, and also to overcome disputes. And it's about creating new livelihoods and strengthening resilience for the people on the ground. In our German Development Corporation systems, we have multitude of instruments to cover the humanitarian development peace nexus and support peace building. But a very important instrument which we have at hand is what we call transitional development assistance, which bridges the gap between humanitarian assistance and long-term development cooperation, and which places a special emphasis on strengthening resilience of the population, strengthening local structures in crisis contexts. Because what we've learned from other studies is that investments into resilience really pays off and reduces expenses for humanitarian assistance. So even in protracted crisis, I think we have to support people and empower them to sustain their own livelihoods. And I think this was also a clear message which came out recently from the fourth Brussels conference on Syria and support to the region. We've just released our new strategy on transitional development assistance, and I'd like to refer you to our website where you can find that new strategy. And this strategy actually puts in place or takes into consideration the key findings of the Building for Peace report, combining recovery, reconstruction, and resilience. Resilience building, and work on all three dimensions of the HDP nexus. And maybe to continue with a practical example, how we do and implement that, and refer to our work in Iraq. In Iraq, our transitional development assistance projects combine reconstruction of infrastructure and basic services, but they also take into consideration the creation of livelihoods and build and work on local peace building and initiate dialogue activities. And we include informal structures and marginalized voices, and help to integrate them into our local planning. Because I think that is important, that we not only work with the local populations during needs assessments or project implementation, but that we rather listen to them when we plan strategically at the very beginning. Because only if we manage to not have just old power brokers shaping the future of the country, I think we will be managed to not only rebuild the past, but rather build for peace and build for a better society. And that is the key message of the Building for Peace report. Maybe just to give you a hint on further practical work in this series of the FCV Virtual Forum, there will be another webinar on our work in Iraq. And I think that could be interesting for colleagues and development practitioners. And there are also some material, including a short film on Iraq in the bank's repository for this launch. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Volker. That was great to hear, the perspective from the German government. Next to Maha, our colleagues have been stressing the importance of planning for the future and going beyond traditional actors and counterparts, as we just heard, importance of true partnership. Based on your work, what are some of the challenges and risks that we're still facing in actually implementing these strategies?
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me on this webinar. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. It's good to be on this panel. I very much agree with what the previous speaker said, and I want to go to something that Ayat just said about being more preferable than peace. This is something that is echoing quite loudly in Lebanon these days, where a country where the civil war, a 15-year civil war, ended in 1990, almost 3 decades ago. So the fundamental issue here, obviously, is that while physical rebuilding can be quick, rebuilding social bonds can take a long time and is almost impossible to achieve without any kind of transitional justice, a process that is tailored to local conditions, one that actually also takes into account questions of economic justice. For Lebanon, the case was very particular, if I use that as an example, where the post-war political settlement basically ended in a kind of an amnesty, no victor, no vanquished mentality, and an amnesty law was passed which forgave all the atrocities committed during the war. That was the trade-off that was done at the time, and this is something we haven't talked a lot about. The trade-off that was done at the time of let's pass an amnesty law, guarantee short-term stabilization. Fast forward 30 years later, and some of the embers of that conflict are still glowing and could erupt again. They're easy to utilize. They're easy to basically instrumentalized by political parties who are interested in doing that. Now, some of the challenges and risks that we would face in trying to understand what a long-term vision would look like, what planning for and also trying to assess the kind of short versus medium to long term. First, obviously, it's security and access. All the countries under study in the MENA region suffer from a breakdown in the central state. Wars are not run in the same way as before. The number of non-state actors is massive. More importantly, the connections between a variety of non-state actors and international sponsors is also quite significant. I'll take the border between Syria and Iraq today, since Iraq is considered as the most stable amongst the 3 countries that this report looks at. The border between Syria and Iraq today is a zone. At least one section of the border is literally a zone where the U.S., where most of the actors on the ground are proxies of Iran, where the U.S. has influence, and where a large variety of regional and international conflicts are taking place. So while the border area is nominally under the control of the Iraqi government, the de facto situation on the ground is much, much more murkier. What has also contributed to this murkiness is that with the expulsion of the Islamic State, there's been very little effort to not only stabilize, but to also recognize some of the exclusionary practices that marked governance of this particular region. And I think the question of governance is key across all these all these countries, but in any context where we want to go in and try and build trust and build a medium to long-term vision of what reconstruction could look like. So today you talk to local communities, and the lack, I mean, many of them prefer to stay. I talk, for example, the Yazidis who were traumatized and brutalized by the Islamic State. Many of them are refusing to go back to their towns and villages because they don't feel safe. They don't trust that the state will protect them, and they don't feel safe about going back to their areas. They want to say in how their own areas are run. They want to say in how things, you know, in assessing their needs, etc. So I think this is the role that the World Bank and others can play when trying to help governments of this region. And again, in Iraq, it might be easier because at least you have some sort of a functioning central state to try and put forward a vision, a medium to long-term vision of reconstruction, rebuilding, actually. Reconstruction is not is not about building things as they were, but actually as they should be. The other, I think, challenge is building the trust of local communities. Again, bricks and mortars are easier. Gaining the trust of local communities, especially local communities who have been traumatized so significantly, and also managing expectations is a big challenge. Managing the expectations of local communities is important, because when they see international actors coming in, automatically they think it's about assistance rather than trying to understand what their needs are. I think another big obstacle, and actually a key to gaining the trust of local communities, are questions of impunity, accountability, and justice. If the injustices committed during conflict are not engaged with and addressed head-on, then the sense of, I mean, the social cohesion will continue to be fragile, if you want. Again, I take Lebanon as an example, but also Iraq. The 2003 moment, you know, the end of the Saddam Hussein era, by 2007, 2008, the country was already in the throes of a civil conflict. I won't go into the details of why that was at the time, but the bottom line is that injustices that had been committed for a very long time went unacknowledged. The final challenge, I would say, is the politicization of reconstruction itself, because many of the actors who are on the ground, whether it's state actors or non-state actors, international actors, will want to politicize this process to try and get as much as they can out of it. For some, it's about returning to the status quo, which is impossible in the countries we're looking at. For some, it's normatively desirable, but it's not politically possible. For others, it's about, frankly, perpetuating structures of domination. I mean, I would look at some of the support that's supposed to be going, humanitarian assistance going to Yemen today. is really, in many ways, it's an effort to maintain support for a broader military effort that is going into the country. And also often reconstruction is used as a way to avoid dealing with difficult issues like responsibility. Places like Syria, where the key party to the conflict, which is the state, the regime, has been accused of forced population transfers and crimes against humanity. So if we start talking about reconstruction in a context like this, it's seen as a, actually as a way to perpetuate the conflict for many, many decades to come. So it's challenging any which way you put it. In Syria, for Western discussions about how about reconstruction is often about how do you win the war, but also how do you win it through reconstruction rather than through a decade of attempting to win it militarily. For the Assad regime, reconstruction is just the end of the conflict and going back to the status quo and the beginning of its international rehabilitation in that way. I'll stop right here.
Thank you so much, Maha. Yeah, I think that's a really important point, is really actually taking the time to think about what does reconstruction mean to different actors, because like you just said, it's not going to be the same thing for everyone involved. And how do you ensure that the folks that really need to be involved in reconstruction are there? And you also made a great point of thinking about the short, medium, and long-term implications of this, which I think has traditionally always been a major issue, is having the patience to have that long-term view and knowing when things can happen immediately and when you're going to have to take some steps that maybe are not going to show fruit for a long time. Nadir,
can I add one sentence to this also? I mean, I think also who would benefit from reconstruction, because if I look at the reconstruction efforts that are underway in Syria today, the European Institute of Peace is actually about to put out a report on the housing and property rights challenges that Syrians are facing today as a result of so-called reconstruction efforts being put forward by the regime, where people are literally being stripped of their housing and of their property under law number 10. So the question again is, who's benefiting from reconstruction and in what way? And I think these are very serious challenges for any effort, especially by the international community. Somebody, I think, needs to mute their mic.
Yeah, thank you for that point, Maha. And Nadir, that actually flows perfectly into what I wanted to ask you about, which is how can we see the World Bank involved in this? That example that Maha just gave of Syria, what are some of the critical entry points as the World Bank looks to pave way for transitions in some of these countries, and how it expects to implement the FCB strategy?
Thank you very much, Teresa. And as I briefly mentioned in my first reflection, it is key to build in a different way and in a much more inclusive way, to include all those affected by conflict and also those involved in conflict. And as my colleagues mentioned before, this can happen only if we focus less on the physical infrastructure that may have been destroyed in the conflict, and build a much more social capital and local communities that have been damaged. If we agree that the final objective is sustainable peace, then we need to think about how we do it differently and concretely. And here I will have two reflections. The first one is how we can go beyond the specific sectoral intervention. And for us in the World Bank and other development institutions, our work and experience have shown that a siloed and a sectoral approach that ignore local political and economic dynamics struggle to break the conflict traps. Focusing on interventions in few selected sectors does not allow the development and humanitarian practitioner to fully address past grievances. Nor does it permit an integrated and coordinated response that will ultimately engage communities living in one area. In fact, the focus should be on restoring not just services, but building trust and social capital, which are the heart of a more peaceful society. And just relate to the example that Maha shared with the Yazidis in Iraq is just clearly how we can build this trust and social capital. This is the point I was mentioning before, and it relates to the need for policymakers to carefully assess the long-term implication of each policy intervention. My second reflection is sustainable peace cannot be achieved without ensuring security and livelihood opportunities for all. Mentioning it also relate to the previous example that the winner of the battle cannot dictate the terms of peace, excluding many other actors. So we need to think of to be inclusive and think of the security and livelihood of all and opportunities for all. So we need to promote inclusive prosperity. That's essential. So this means we need to resist building or rebuilding a governance system that can perpetuate exclusion, informality, private rent seeking. Therefore, an informed, integrated long-term vision must be accompanied by effort to promote this inclusive development. In other words, this means we need to think beyond large investment and instead focus on how to enable and catalyze the creation of local-based private sector jobs. Let me give you an example from our current intervention in Yemen. I actually lived in Sana'a in Yemen in the early 2000s. The country was coming out of the mid-1990 conflict. So what are we doing currently? Maybe share with you just one example where we finance a small-scale labor-intensive work carried out by a locally based firm. So this generates jobs and local incomes, develop economic assets for future growth, but it's also a way to support this small-scale firm to survive, and that will be critical for future jobs and growth. The small-scale and locally based enterprises supported through this project is also to counterbalance the large contracts benefiting much bigger firms for more major infrastructure projects. As I mentioned before, and my colleagues also, and I think Ayat mentioned this anonymous online survey where 13,000 online random internet users in Iraq, Libya, and Yemen, they have also expressed that the major finding about of those interviews was the importance of jobs. So citizens in these three countries cited job opportunities as the main issue taking into peace building work that we could guarantee a better transition towards sustainable peace. This, however, can be challenging because in many cases, if we focus on creating economic opportunities and jobs for all, undermine the economic gains associated with the conflict and poses a threat to illicit interests. As we know in many of these conflicts that we know very well, part of the conflict or a militia or a force have put its hand on natural resources and extract illicit interests. And so for those, there will be, it's not going to be easy to surmount their interests. So to conclude, sustainable peace needs jobs. and jobs that are also meaningful and that they provide livelihood and dignity to those employed in the longer term. So this begins to tilt the balance by making a relapse into conflict much more costly for people and for communities. And that's the second conclusion of this work, and a principle that's also guiding our intervention based on the FCV strategy.
Thank you, Nadir. I would love to involve our audience now, bring them into the conversation. We have been receiving some questions, and I'd love to move into question and answer. Our first question, I think I would love to hear from both Ayat and Volker on this one. It is, I am curious to learn how the report's recommendations, like the focus on improving state-society relations or the social contract, translate into analysis and operations in both bi and multilateral development. Ayat, if you want to start with that one.
Excellent, thank you so much. I think that several of my colleagues, previous speakers, mentioned elements of a paradigm shift. And it's a paradigm shift that really focuses away from, or not just away, but in addition to the bricks and mortar and the physical infrastructure, to really focusing on people and communities and understanding better their assets and their demands. So I think that is the central premise of how we can put ourselves in a different mode of designing and engaging on what we need to plan for interventions in these conflict settings. So again, that paradigm shift and the work and the focus on people and communities will allow us to really define clearly what do we need to focus on in terms of rebuilding, what do communities need to break out of the cycle of violence, but also what can we rely on in terms of existing assets or assets that have survived the war to be able to build from that the social fabric, the institutions, the systems, the mechanics that allow the social contract between the state and the citizens and the people to be rebuilt. Perhaps one thing that hasn't been mentioned is we're focusing on the place where the conflict happens, but a lot of the conflict gets also transported out by the fact that numbers of people move out of certain countries and get displaced into other countries. And that shifts the range of demands for interventions and for support much broader to the location where the conflict potentially has originated. And the example that we have, for example, in terms of looking in the MENA region more broadly at the displacement question, whether it is internally displaced people and the work we are doing in Iraq, for example, on the liberated areas, but also in Lebanon and Jordan, to look at the support to the municipalities and the cities and locations where displaced people from Syria have arrived and have caused an influx and an additional stress on the systems, on the services, etc. And what can we do there to both support the host communities as well as the refugees? So in fact, I think it's a much broader look, and I think that's where the report provides a lot of richness in terms of the analysis and also some granularity to the examples that I know will be presented in a number of seminars and webinars that are coming up in the Fragility Forum, including examples from Yemen and Iraq in particular. But let me just end by saying that essentially the peace building process and the role of the international actors in it really is to recognize that we need to be honest about who are the winners and losers. Maha spoke about it, Nadir just mentioned it, and understanding and not shying away from understanding these incentives for those that will potentially spoil the transition to peace, and how can we put in place measures and responses and mechanisms that help counter that. Maybe one last thing on that is to also think as partners in this process with the governments, how can we sustain the dialogue? Often enough, again, on our side, you know, teams go, people change, and the lessons from the engagement and the involvement over a period of time in the peace building could be lost. So how do we capture the understanding, the knowledge that has been gained from trying things on the ground, building over time, etc., and translating that into the next generations of engagement going forward? And for that, I really think that partnerships like the one we have now, for example, with our German colleagues, partnerships among actors engaging in dialogues in a sustained way and feeding into that the lessons learned, the synthesis of the experiences, but also, over long histories of time. It's important to understand the history, but also to focus on the people, their future, and their aspiration.
Thank you so much, Ayat. Volker, do you have some thoughts to add to that?
Yes, thank you very much, Teresa. I think as it was just said, the report calls for long-term and comprehensive approach. I think Ayat said we need a broader look at the whole set of challenges, and it's probably fair to say that's not easy. Because if we look at crisis situations, often the initial political and also public focus is on immediate support for displaced and war-affected people and reconstruction of efforts in liberated areas. But then we have the call from the Building for Peace report, which says you also need, right from the start, look at the long-term vision. You need to focus on reforms right from the outset. And that, I think, we have to manage. And from my perspective, there are two elements which are very important. The one is on partnership, I just mentioned. I think we need joint development partner approaches, including the host governments. And if we can take an example from Iraq again. There in Iraq, the World Bank set up, with the support of Germany and the UK, a reform fund, the Iraq Reform, Recovery and Reconstruction Fund, which is intended to merge our joint support for reforms, and which is also a good vehicle to leverage the reform agenda. And the second point is that we need to build our support programs that they take into consideration all the various dimensions of reconstruction. Again, another example from our approach in Iraq. Because in Iraq, beyond the immediate support we provided for displaced people and also reconstruction efforts in liberated areas, we started very early with programs which had a longer development angle. With respect to private sector development, with respect to job creation, and I think that is an issue which also comes out from the recent or current processes in Iraq, where the young generation asked for long-term reforms, even in crisis situations, and I think we need to take that up constructively. I'd say the Building for Peace report is a good start and gives food for thought in many respects, but we probably also have to admit that we need to further work on the issues we've just discussed today. There's some elements which can be elaborated on further, the issue of strengthening the role of women in reconstruction efforts, the issue of the ecological challenges of reconstructions, because in the end, reconstruction will only work when it's done in a climate-friendly and sustainable manner. By the way, that's also a challenge which we have to deal with in the current COVID pandemic. And there are a number of other issues I think we have to focus on when we further work on these issues. What we from the German side like to initiate together with colleagues from the World Bank and other development partners working in the region is really to set up learning platforms around these issues, where we can do further case studies, where we can have peer learning exercises to make the proposals of the report even more practical and relevant. And we would appreciate any contribution, suggestion, and interaction from other partners in this context. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Volker. We have got time for one last question. We are coming up on 10 o'clock now. This question is for Maha. We've heard several people talk about repairing social fabric and strengthening social contract. From your perspective, what do those things mean in practice? What kind of interventions could help achieve these goals? And I'm also going to tack on a second question of my own for you, Maha. Volker just mentioned COVID-19, and that's the first that we have brought that up. And obviously the report that we are discussing was in progress before the pandemic has overtook the globe. But I also would be curious sort of in your thoughts when we're thinking about the pandemic environment and the complication, but also perhaps opportunity that that provides when we're talking about rebuilding.
Thank you. Good question. I'll start with the COVID one, and then I'll go back to the social contract one. I mean, obviously, the COVID-19 has complicated things further in incredibly fragile context. We're talking about conflict countries. Structural challenges that were already in place have become even more apparent. I'll take one, which is rampant inequality. The percentage of people today that are falling beneath the poverty line is significant. What does that mean for us moving forward? What it means is that there are opportunities, but also there are tremendous challenges because the region is losing out on the significant development gains it had gotten over the past few decades. The opportunities lie in the fact that with the economic collapse of some of these countries, there may be more opportunities to invest in local production and new economic activities that could create, basically enhance, open the door for locally sourced production, basically. I'm thinking, for example, what does it mean? I know, for example, in Lebanon, in the midst of this crisis, there's now been an increased focus on web sourcing, technology-related activities that are not place-specific and that could generate jobs for people here. But above and beyond that, it also opens the door to the bigger question, which is what does social contract and social cohesion mean for this region? Rebuilding a social contract, it's not just about rebuilding the relationship of states to their citizens. These are citizens that historically have not been treated as equal by their states and by state institutions. That historically, these are states that historically have been captured by the political elite. So rebuilding social cohesion and the social contract, as actually the report puts nicely, is about restoring state institutions, working, regaining the state's footprint in its different, across its national territory. And I take the example of Yemen. One of the reasons why Al-Qaeda was able to establish a significant footprint on the ground is because there are no state institutions, but where they are, they're incredibly weak and they're not providing services. So where there's a power vacuum, things are going to emerge. But this is not enough. But also where there needs to be systematic work is building these horizontal connections between communities that are incredibly traumatized. And if these traumas are not addressed, again, Lebanon as a prime example, the underlying tensions, whether they're ethnic, sectarian, identity-based, economic-based, gender-based, whatever they are, well, gender has never has not led to a civil war as far as I know, but maybe peace building. And I agree here with Volker that there needs to be a lot more focus on peace building. But bottom line is, rebuilding the social contract means working with the local communities, local elders perhaps, on trying to find frameworks for, again, transitional justice, for building networks within, at the level of the village, the town, and the region, even before you go to the national level. I hope this kind of answered your question.
Yes, thank you so much. I am going to wrap up our conversation now. We are slightly over time. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us and for engaging in this conversation. It's been so interesting to hear details of the report and hear a little bit more about the work that now needs to be done. You know, we've heard points made about how further work on these issues are required, and moving away from bricks and mortar to people is difficult but necessary. And obviously, as we just heard, the COVID-19 pandemic is now going to complicate matters even further, particularly in societies where, you know, security and trust are already quite fragile, and there needs to be more movement towards inclusivity, both in society and in institutions. Thank you all so much for joining us today. This conversation will be posted on the Fragility Forum's YouTube page. If you would love to share with colleagues or anyone else that you think would have interest. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you at future Fragility Forum events.